I never imagined that the happiest day in my son's life would be the one that shattered my trust in him completely. But as I stood in that grand hall filled with flowers, chandeliers, and whispered judgments, I realized something was breaking inside me, and it wasn't the decor or the expensive cake. It was the bond between mother and child. A bond one had spent decades nurturing with sacrifices that no one ever saw. Late nights working extra shifts. Bills paid quietly so Ryan could have his chance. At a future, a home, an education, and now a marriage, all of it tied together by my invisible hands and the money I had poured into every detail. Yet in that moment I was treated as though I was nothing more than an unwanted guest, disposable and embarrassing, someone who had overstayed her welcome. And the worst part wasn't the sharp words from Emma or the way her eyes sliced through me with disdain. The worst part was the silence from my son, the boy I raised alone, the boy whose scraped knees I kissed and whose college tuition I fought tooth and nail to cover, now standing there stiff and voiceless, eyes glued to the floor as if he were a stranger, unable to offer even the smallest defense. And that silence echoed louder than the music that had stopped, louder than the gasps of the guests who pretended to look away, louder than anything else in that room. It screamed to me that I was on my own, and in that realization came something I hadn't expected. Not just sorrow but a simmering anger, the kind that doesn't explode right away but coils itself tight like steel waiting for the right moment to strike. Because I knew then that I was finished being the quiet one, the one who always held her tongue, the one who picked up the pieces while everyone else enjoyed the show. No more swallowing humiliation for the sake of appearances. No more letting people drain me while thanking me with contempt. And as I walked out under the soft glow of string lights that no longer looked magical, clutching the purse that carried receipts of every dollar I had spent to create their perfect fantasy, I felt something cold but empowering rise within me, a decision forming that if they wanted to erase me from this celebration, then they could also erase the money, the effort, and the support that made it all possible, because I was done funding my own mistreatment. I was done pretending that love meant giving endlessly until I disappeared. I was ready to teach them a lesson they would never forget. When I returned home that night, the silence of my house felt heavier than ever, and as I sat at the kitchen table with only the ticking clock for company, I began to sift through the binder I had kept for months, filled with invoices, receipts, and neatly labeled tabs, each page a reminder of how much I had invested not only financially but emotionally in what I believed would be a new chapter of family unity. And as my fingers traced the contracts and signatures, my mind replayed every small humiliation I had endured leading up to this moment, the comments about how Emma's family had better taste, the subtle digs that my choices weren't stylish enough, the way Ryan would dismiss my opinions with a quick "Emma knows best," as though the years of my experience and the sacrifices I made meant nothing at all. And the longer I stared at those papers, the clearer it became that every detail of their fairy tale was balanced precariously on my shoulders, yet I was treated like an intruder, and in that clarity a plan began to form, not out of malice but out of a deep aching need to reclaim my dignity, because if they wanted me invisible then they would feel what life without me truly looked like. So I began dialing one number after another, the venue first, then the caterer, the florist, the photographer, each call almost mechanical, my voice steady as I confirmed cancellations, each vendor hesitating, shocked but unable to argue. Once they realized my name, not Emma's, was on the dotted line, and with each termination I felt a small piece of strength return to me, as though I were slowly stitching myself back together from the unraveling that had started the moment Emma told me to leave. And by the time I hung up on the last call, I realized my hands had stopped trembling, replaced instead with a calm steel resolve that surprised me, because for decades I had been the fixer, the peacemaker, the woman who made excuses for others' cruelty and convinced herself that loyalty was measured by how much pain one could quietly absorb. But not anymore. And it wasn't long before my phone began to light up, Ryan's name flashing over and over, first with texts, then with calls, each one dripping with entitlement and blame, as though I were the one sabotaging them, when in reality all I had done was pull back what never should have been taken for granted in the first place. And as the notifications piled higher, my anger sharpened into something almost icy, because it became clear that not once, not in a single message did he ask if I was okay or apologize for standing silent while his fiancée humiliated me? No, instead it was all demands, accusations, threats of how I was destroying his life, and each word only confirmed what I already knew, that to him and to Emma I wasn't a mother or even a person. I was simply a bank, a resource to be drained until nothing remained, and I realized then that their love had strings attached, strings tied directly to my wallet and my willingness to stay silent, and with that realization the grief I had felt earlier began to recede, leaving behind something harder, more enduring, determination. And as the night stretched on, I thought of all the times I had compromised, swallowed my pride, and pretended the hurt didn't cut as deep as it did. Birthdays missed because I was covering shifts to pay his tuition, nights spent worrying if the mortgage would be paid so he could focus on his studies, all of it erased in a single moment of silence from the one person I had believed would always stand beside me. And I knew then that the only way forward was to stop waiting for validation that would never come and to reclaim what was left of my self-respect. So when the pounding on my door came hours later, his voice calling out, "Mom, open up, we need to talk," I didn't answer. I sat perfectly still in the dark, letting him feel what absence truly meant, because for the first time I understood that the only power I had ever lacked was the power of no, and in that quiet refusal I felt more powerful than I had in years. The next morning I awoke with the weight of everything pressing down on my chest, yet instead of drowning in despair I found myself strangely calm, as though the storm had already passed, and now I was left with clear skies that demanded I make choices for myself rather than for those who only saw me as useful when my money was on the table. So I brewed a cup of coffee and sat down again with the binder, not to wallow this time but to remind myself of the reality that I had been the architect of every detail, and therefore I had the authority to dismantle it when respect was denied. And as the steam curled upward, I scrolled through my emails, noticing confirmations of cancellations trickling in one by one, the venue officially releasing the date, the florist confirming forfeiture of the deposit, the photographer apologizing but acknowledging my rights as contract holder, and each notification felt like a quiet victory, a declaration that my presence mattered, not because I was begging for acceptance but because I was the foundation of the entire event, and without me there was nothing but an empty hall and some angry messages. And as if on cue my phone buzzed again, Ryan's name filling the screen, his voice on the voicemail brittle with anger, insisting I was overreacting, insisting that Emma hadn't meant it the way it sounded, insisting that I should fix things for his sake. But I knew now that fixing things only ever meant sacrificing myself further, and I refused to step back into that role. So I let the calls go unanswered until finally curiosity won, and I listened only to hear the same accusations, the same entitlement that had become his language. And though the words stung, I realized with startling clarity that they no longer had the power to control me, because love that demands silence is not love, it is manipulation, and manipulation is not something I would fund anymore. And as the hours rolled by, the narrative began to spread, Emma posting tearful updates online, painting me as a villain desperate to sabotage her happiness, and for a brief moment I felt the familiar sting of being misunderstood, judged by strangers who only heard her polished lies. But then something shifted, because in the quiet of my home, surrounded by proof of every payment and contract, I remembered that the truth does not need to scream, it simply waits until it can no longer be denied. And I began to collect screenshots, receipts, and emails, not with the frantic energy of someone fighting to prove innocence, but with the steady patience of someone preparing for the inevitable reckoning, because I knew lies built on entitlement always collapse under their own weight, and I would be ready when that collapse came. And late in the afternoon, as the sunlight spilled across the floor, my door rattled once again, Ryan pounding louder than before, his voice raised, accusing me of destroying his future. And I stood behind the door listening, unmoved, my hand steady, as I whispered to myself that the boy I raised no longer stood there, only a man who had allowed entitlement to hollow him out. And when his fists finally stilled and his car pulled away, leaving silence behind, I did not cry, I did not shake, I only felt the quiet strength of knowing that for once in my life I had chosen myself, and that choice, though painful, was the first step toward freedom from a cycle I should have broken years ago. And in that moment I promised myself that I would not be coerced by guilt or smeared by lies. I would let them rage, I would let them flail, and I would stand firm, because they needed to learn that the price of humiliating me was losing the very support they had so carelessly exploited. By the time the weekend arrived, the calls had turned from angry demands to desperate pleas, and even though part of me ached at the sound of my son's voice cracking with panic, I forced myself to remember the look on his face when he chose silence over defending me, because that silence had told me everything I needed to know about where his loyalty lay, and no amount of begging now could rewrite that moment. So when my sister-in-law called urging me to be the bigger person and restore the wedding, I listened in silence until she finished, and then simply told her that being the bigger person did not mean endlessly funding disrespect before ending the call. And when my ex-husband Mark reached out next with his familiar condescending tone telling me not to be dramatic and to think about Ryan's happiness, I felt the sharp sting of old wounds, but I steadied my voice and told him flatly that if he had been present at that rehearsal, perhaps he would have understood why I would no longer bankroll my own humiliation. And I hung up without hesitation, because the days of letting him define me were long gone, and though each call reopened scars from years of compromise, they also hardened my resolve, because the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. I was not loved for who I was but for what I provided. And if I removed the provision, what remained was anger, blame, and manipulation, none of which looked like love at all. And in that clarity, I realized that the greatest gift I could give myself was the permission to step out of the role of savior and finally let others face the consequences of their own choices. So I met with my attorney Margaret on Monday morning, and as she leafed through the documents I had brought her, she nodded approvingly, pointing out that I had been meticulous in saving every contract, every receipt, every email, her calm professional voice assuring me that I held all the power legally and financially. And as she drafted the formal notices to vendors confirming my cancellations and authority, I felt the weight lift further from my shoulders, because for the first time in years I was not reacting out of fear or guilt, I was acting with intention. And when Margaret suggested freezing the old account Ryan still had access to, I hesitated for only a moment before agreeing, because I realized that account had been a symbol of my unconditional support, but now it had become a weapon used against me. And cutting it off was not cruelty, it was survival. And as the paperwork was signed, sealed, and filed, I felt something new growing inside me, not anger, not grief, but a quiet, steady power, the kind that comes from finally enforcing boundaries that should have been respected long ago. And when I walked out of her office into the bright afternoon sun, I knew that no matter what storm came next, I would not bend this time. I would stand firm, even if it meant standing alone. When the first wave of gossip hit the town, I could almost feel the shift in the air as messages poured into my phone from distant relatives, neighbors, and even acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in years, all asking what had really happened. And though part of me wanted to defend myself, to lay out every receipt and proof I held in my hands, I resisted, because I had learned that sometimes silence speaks louder than any explanation. And sure enough, the cracks in their carefully crafted story began to spread on their own, with Emma posting tearful videos online about how her wicked mother-in-law destroyed her wedding, only for whispers to surface that she had never paid a single bill, and vendors quietly letting it slip that all contracts were under my name. And soon people began putting the pieces together, realizing the truth without me having to lift a finger. And watching that unfold was strangely liberating, because for years I had been the one scrambling to explain myself, to justify my sacrifices, to beg for scraps of gratitude. But now I simply sat back, sipping tea, as their own lies unraveled in public, and with every new message of outrage directed at them, I felt another layer of shame peel away from me, because finally they were being forced to confront the reality that entitlement has consequences. And while Emma scrambled to block comments and Ryan sulked in silence, I took my first real weekend off in years, treating myself to a quiet spa retreat by the coast. And as I lay on a balcony with the ocean breeze washing over me, I realized that the freedom I was tasting wasn't just from one ruined wedding, but from a lifetime of allowing others to dictate my worth. And in that moment I promised myself I would never again confuse sacrifice with love, or silence with peace, because true peace does not come from being trampled, it comes from standing tall and refusing to let anyone write your story for you. And so while the world around them buzzed with scandal and pity, I chose to focus on my own healing, my own joy, and my own future, no longer tethered to people who only remembered me when they needed my money. And for the first time in decades I felt whole. By the middle of the following week, the storm had grown too large for them to contain, and I heard through whispers that guests were canceling their travel plans one after another, unwilling to waste time and money on an event that no longer existed. And though a small part of me wondered if Ryan would finally see the truth, the silence from him spoke volumes. He had chosen to stay beside Emma even as the world turned on them, and that choice cut deeper than any insult because it confirmed that my years of sacrifice had been repaid not with loyalty but with betrayal. And so when another message from him arrived, this time cloaked in false forgiveness, telling me they were willing to allow me to attend their wedding if I promised to behave, I felt laughter bubble up, not from joy but from disbelief, because here they were with no venue, no florist, no music, no guests, and yet they still believed they held the power to grant me permission into a life I had already built for them. And that laugh turned into clarity because I understood at last that I owed them nothing, not explanations, not apologies, not even responses. So I deleted the message and returned to my book, letting their desperation fade into the background noise it had always been. And later that night, as I sat on my porch watching the sky darken, I realized that revenge wasn't about screaming back or proving them wrong. It was about reclaiming my time, my money, and most of all my dignity, and letting the consequences of their actions teach them the lessons I never could. And when more relatives tried to intervene, insisting that I fix the situation, I told them calmly that fixing meant enabling and enabling meant betraying myself, and I was finished betraying myself for anyone. And with that resolve, a peace settled over me that I had not felt in years, because I finally knew that no matter how loudly they shouted, no matter how many lies they spun, I had stepped out of their chaos and into my own strength, and there was no going back. As days slipped into the next week, I watched from a distance as their carefully polished image crumbled faster than even I expected, because whispers had turned into conversations and conversations into open laughter, with people online mocking the sheer audacity of a couple who humiliated the very person who bankrolled their entire dream. And though I did not comment or defend myself, strangers did it for me, pulling together threads of evidence, screenshots of Emma's own posts cross-referenced with leaked invoices, and even whispers from vendors who admitted they had warned her repeatedly that I was the sole contract holder. And the more this truth spread, the quieter Ryan and Emma became, their once daily flood of photos and hashtags drying up until only silence remained. And in that silence I felt a kind of healing begin, because for the first time in decades I was not the one scrambling to clean up someone else's mess. Instead, I was watching them face the fallout of their own arrogance and entitlement. And though I might have expected to feel triumph, what surprised me was the deep calm that filled me instead, because revenge had never been about hurting them, it had been about finally refusing to let them hurt me. And as I sat on my balcony one evening watching the sunset paint the sky gold, I thought about the years I had wasted trying to earn love through sacrifice, the countless times I had said yes when every fiber of me wanted to say no, the nights I had gone without so my son could have more. And I realized that this moment was not just the end of a wedding, it was the end of a cycle, the end of a woman being treated as invisible while carrying everyone else's burdens. And in that realization came freedom, the kind that could not be taken away by lies or manipulation, because it came from within me. And so when another call came from Ryan, a final attempt to mend things on his terms, I let it ring out into the night, because the truth was clear: he had made his choice, and so had I, and for once my choice was myself. On the morning their cancelled wedding should have taken place, I woke not to frantic schedules or endless errands, but to the sound of waves outside the hotel balcony where I had chosen to treat myself. And as I stretched in the quiet luxury of a suite paid for with my own money, I felt no regret, only relief, because while they were scrambling to explain to guests why nothing existed anymore, I was sipping coffee with the sun warming my face and realizing that peace tastes better than champagne at any banquet. And though part of me wondered if Ryan still believed I would swoop in at the last moment to save them, the truth was I had no intention of rescuing anyone, because rescue had been my role for far too long, and I was done playing it. So instead I ordered breakfast in bed and watched the ocean glitter, thinking about how this day marked not their celebration but my rebirth, because I had finally severed the last strings that tied my worth to their approval. And when my phone buzzed with more messages demanding conversation, I simply turned it face down, letting it vibrate into silence, because nothing they could say would erase the fact that love without respect is hollow, and I would no longer accept hollow love, no matter who it came from. And by afternoon, when I saw on social media that rumors of the fiasco had spread so widely that people were openly mocking Emma's arrogance, I didn't gloat. I simply closed the app and poured myself another glass of wine, because revenge was not About their humiliation, it was about my liberation, and that was already complete. And as the day faded into night, I stood on the balcony watching the horizon and felt something I hadn't in years, a lightness in my chest, a certainty that I was no longer chained to being the fixer, the provider, the scapegoat. I was free, and that freedom was worth far more than any wedding or relationship built on manipulation could ever be. And so I whispered to myself a promise that from this day forward I would never again fund my own mistreatment, and with that vow sealed in the quiet of the night, I finally felt at peace.